In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. In 2020, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow. My name is Joanna Holleck, and I'm the coordinator of the Sunset Series with Eastham 400. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Sunset Series. Today, June 25th, is the day that Massachusetts ratified the 19th Amendment, which would eventually grant women the right to vote. Massachusetts was the 8th state to ratify this amendment, and although Massachusetts did so on June 25, 1919, the amendment did not actually become effective until August 18, 1920. The 19th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." The ratification of this amendment in Massachusetts followed years of advocacy. Decades earlier, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. In addition to important events such as this, there were a number of famous suffragists from Massachusetts, including Lucy Stone, Louisa May Alcott, Sojourner Truth, and Lucretia Mott, who was from Nantucket. So it is clear that Massachusetts played an important role in women's suffrage. One famous example of an advocacy event for women's suffrage was the Boston protest of 1919. At this event, 22 suffragists were arrested in front of the State House for trying to picket President Woodrow Wilson. Although this protest in Boston and other aspects of the women's suffrage movement are well documented, less is known about the suffrage movement on Cape Cod. We do know that there were several lectures about women's suffrage on Cape Cod, including here in Eastham. A newspaper article from 1915 reports that Mrs. Gilman Drew of Woods Hole lectured at the Eastham Town Hall on women's suffrage. It was fairly well attended, and Mrs. Drew's version of what women could do if allowed to vote seemed very feasible. Another newspaper article from 1915 states that the Votes for Women Victory campaigners are making a tour of the Cape this week and will campaign in conjunction with the local suffrage leagues. Despite these references, very little is known about these local suffrage leagues or the women from Cape Cod who fought for women's suffrage. When I was researching the women's suffrage movement in preparation for this episode of the Sunset Series, I reached out to several local historians to ask why so little is known about Cape Cod's involvement in the suffrage movement. One historian wondered whether the lack of information was the result of Cape Cod's socioeconomic structure. At this time, women's suffrage was primarily carried out by upper-class women, but many of the women living on Cape Cod were not as wealthy as women from other parts of the state. Alternatively, or additionally, another local historian explained that 100 years ago, the majority of people on Cape Cod tended to have more conservative political views and may have been less enthusiastic about the progressive suffrage movement. After reaching out to a number of historical societies, libraries, online databases, and historians, I was disappointed that I was unable to learn more about suffragists from Eastham or the surrounding towns. I am sure that there were passionate, dedicated, and impressive women on Cape Cod during this period, so I regret that I do not have more information to share with you about who these women were and what they accomplished. However, as we move forward into the summer and continue to produce Sunset Series videos, I invite you to reach out to me if you know anything about the suffrage movement on Cape Cod or specific information about individual women who participated. Although this lack of information was disappointing, I was, however, pleasantly surprised to learn Eastham 400 is not the first organization or individual to connect the women's suffrage movement with the historical events of the early 17th century. A newspaper article from 1917 reads, "Massachusetts is guided by the beacon lights of history in its opposition to equal suffrage. That is just what the trouble with Massachusetts is. It is continually glancing over its shoulder in search of a frown on the face of its ancestry. It still clings to the idea that a woman's proper place is at the washtub, because, forsooth, one of the beacon lights of history tells it that when the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in Provincetown Harbor, they set their women to do the washing, thus fixing for all time the status of women in Massachusetts. It is true that the women in Massachusetts had different tasks and daily lifestyles and duties as the men. It is also true that very little is known about the female colonists who lived in Plymouth and in Eastham. This was pointed out by suffragist Ernestine L. Rose in 1850, when she stated, 'We have heard a great deal about the Pilgrim Fathers, but who has heard of the Pilgrim Mothers?' This has also been pointed out to me by some of our Sunset Series presenters. Many of the records from 1620 and other records from the Plymouth colonists and the Eastham colonists were focused primarily on the men. Nevertheless, some people claim that the fight for political and human rights and equality began in 1620. A newspaper article about Suffrage Information Week that was published in 1915 stated that next November the men of Massachusetts are to vote on a constitutional amendment to enfranchise the women of Massachusetts and thus complete the political equality of all citizens, toward which we have been aiming since 1620. This quote is interesting to me for several reasons. Not only does it reference 1620, the year of the first encounter, as the start of the fight for political equality, but it also claims that the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 would end the fight for political equality. This statement that the 19th Amendment, quote, completes the political equality of all citizens, end quote, is inaccurate. One example of this inaccuracy is that Native Americans were still unable to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. It wasn't until the Snyder Act of 1924 that Native Americans were granted full U.S. citizenship, allowing them to vote. However, even after the passage of this act, some states did not allow Native Americans to vote until the early 1960s. Even today, there are many minorities in the United States who do not have the same political rights as other citizens. Despite the political inequality that still exists in our country today, I believe it is still important that we reflect on and commemorate Massachusetts' ratification of the 19th Amendment. Although this was not the finish line of political equality in the U.S., it was an important step towards it. I invite you back to the Sunset Series later in the summer, when we will delve more deeply into these themes and discuss the steps that we today are still taking. Thank you. Thank you again for your support of this series. If you're interested in participating in other series that are happening locally this summer, there is an upcoming concert series. The first concert will be held on July 6th at 7 p.m. at the Eastham Windmill. There will be grids that are created in the grass to help people maintain social distancing, and everybody above the age of 3 is required to wear a mask. Within the grids, people will be able to dance and enjoy the music. So we invite you to come to these concerts and to appreciate the beautiful historical landmark that is the Eastham Windmill. Thank you.